We have had a full 24 hours to dig into the Mueller report, and House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler issued a subpoena earlier today demanding the full unredacted report delivered to his committee by May 1st, which is just 12 days from now. The version released yesterday contained nearly 1,000 redactions and had 7 entire pages completely blacked out. Nadler says he also plans on calling special counsel Robert Mueller to testify about the report. A reminder, the report does not indict President Trump on any charges, nor does it definitively say he obstructed justice, but it does lay out evidence showing how Trump and his ally solicited and accepted assistance from Russia, one of America's most storied foreign adversaries. And that poses the question, is Trump a risk to our national security?
All right, joining us now is Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois. He's a member of the House Intel Committee, and Vicky Duvall, former general counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, former deputy legal advisor to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Congressman, let's start with you. This is obviously, this becomes complicated because now most other things that happened, with the exception of the 14 legal referrals that came out of the Mueller report, most of the other action, if there's going to be more action, is going to come from Congress. What do you think about what Congress should do now?
Ellie, I think that there are 2 things that we have to do. One, we have to get all the underlying documents supporting this report, as well as Chairman Jerry Nadler requested, all the unredacted portions. And then 2, we should also have Bob Mueller come in and testify. I know that Chairman Adam Schiff requested his presence before the House Intelligence Committee, so I expect that to happen in short order as well.
Vicky, in just the last hour, former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, said that President Trump publicly criticizing the Russian government would be far more effective than the report on his own. And President Trump hasn't said anything about that. Put into perspective, his own national security people have said Russia interfered. We know that the report specifically details, has the names of Russian agents, and the president hasn't mentioned word one. What's the national security risk here?
Well, the national security risk is profound, as you can imagine. It doesn't take an expert to see that. Any of the American people who want to read the report will see that. There's 100 pages of interactions between the Trump entourage and Russian intelligence officers. You know, there's a good rule of thumb. If a lot of Russians are being nice to you, they're probably intelligence officers. And they knew or should have known what they were doing. The fact, as you point out, that the president has not stepped up and even acknowledged the Russian attack on our electoral system, the damage that was done. He doesn't want to do that because the damage that was done was his election. And it's clear that it was a mutual beneficial society between the Russians and the campaign. They were both gaining from these interactions.
I mean, it's kind of fascinating, Congressman. The president won't tackle the one thing that everybody agrees upon. All of his intelligence officials and the Mueller report. I mean, if there was just no conflict in the report about Russian activity, and yet the president doesn't want to do that. That would be an interesting point for sort of everybody to move forward on, to say, fine, put aside what the Trump campaign had to do with this. What we need to do is make sure our elections moving forward are safe from interference.
That's absolutely right. On page 1 of the Mueller report, volume 1, Mr. Mueller makes it clear that the Russians interfered in a quote-unquote sweeping and systematic fashion. And here in Illinois, which is where I'm talking to you from, the Russians hacked into our voter database and basically looked at tens of thousands of records of people, and that included their personal information as well as Social Security numbers and the rest. We have to, as a country, come together, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and basically make sure that they don't do that again in 2020, which is what I think that they intend to do. And this is happening in red states, blue states, every state.
Where and how? What is your plan to do that? On that first page that you referenced, straight out of the gate, Robert Mueller says social media is how they did it. Is there a concrete plan to regulate social media?
Well, you bring up a great point. Obviously, that's something that we would have to cooperate with private entities like Facebook and Twitter and other platforms.
You just have to regulate them. They don't have to like it.
Well, I think I think that's a good point. I think that on the other hand, we also need some of their cooperation with regard to what are the threats that they are seeing on their end right now that we may not have visibility into. So in regulating them or coming up with the right rules, we also need to understand what are the threats that they're seeing from their side too.
Vicki, if the Department of Justice refuses to comply with the subpoena that Jerry Nadler issued this morning, what happens? What if they don't? The committee, Jerry Nadler's committee, doesn't get the unredacted report by May 1st. What happens then?
Well, there are a lot of steps they can take. I think the chances of them getting what they want cooperatively with the Trump administration are minuscule. Normally, historically, there has been a lot of comedy back and forth between the executive branch and the legislative branch over disagreements over how much information they are able to obtain. But this is not an administration that deals in a cooperative way. So the subpoena will go forward. There's not a lot of case law out there because a lot of these cases don't go to court. But this one probably will have to, and I assume it will be expedited and we'll get a ruling. I think that's probably the way. In the meantime, they can call up witnesses, they can have public hearings, they can do all sorts of other oversight activities, they can get more access through the intelligence committees, because by law, the intelligence committees have to get access to these materials.
Can I jump in on that real quick?
Yeah.
There's just one point. With regard to counterintelligence information, we are statutorily allowed to see that information, even if it's been sequestered in a grand jury setting or what have you.
Correct.
I mean, that glossary to the Mueller report reads like the Russian phone book. There's extensive ties, and we need to know, even if those ties don't rise to a criminal nature, whether that information could be used as compromat by the Russians, compromising information that they could leverage to endanger our national security and Trump administration officials.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.